Good evening, everyone. It's great to see everybody out for the last university lecture of the semester. My name is Cal Alston. I'm the director of the lectures. And just to give you a little bit of a taste of what's coming in the spring semester, we have on February 27th, Roz Savage, who's an ocean rower, adventurer, and environmental campaigner. On March 5th, Connor Grennan, who's the founder of Next Generation Nepal, that organization fights child trafficking. March 19th, Jim Richardson, a National Geographic photographer, who's going to be doing a great piece on light pollution. April 5th, David Henry Wong, who's a Tony Award-winning playwright and screenwriter. And Connor Grennan and David Henry Wong are switched from the calendar that we distributed over the summer, so just keep that in mind. The university lectures are made possible through a generous gift from university friend Bob Menschel. And tonight's lecture is co-sponsored with the Department of Public Health, Food Studies, and Nutrition in the Falk College. I ask everyone if they will turn off or mute or somehow suppress your electronic devices that might make noise during the lecture tonight. Our guest will be autographing books in the lobby after the lecture. We ask that you not come surging this direction so she can go that direction and start signing books. Those of you who've been to these before know that my job is generally to A, get you to turn off your phones, but B, to introduce the introducers. And as usual, it's a person that I'm pleased to introduce as a colleague of mine, associate professor and chairperson of the Department of Public Health, Food Studies, and Nutrition. Kay Brunig-Stearns. Recent research interests are in the prevention of and intervention for child overweight and obesity issues. She collaborates with the SUNY Upstate Medical University Department of Pediatrics to offer group education programs for youth and their families, and serves as a consultant to the New York State Department of Health Child and Adult Care food programs for their obesity prevention initiatives. She also consults on a longitudinal study on bone density, skeletal, and pubertal development in girls with an interdisciplinary group from SUNY Upstate and SU's Department of Exercise Science. Prior to joining the SU faculty, Dr. Brunig studied diet, nutrition, and immunity as part of an interdisciplinary research team at Medical University. She's also published and presented in the area of dietetics education. Happy to introduce Kay Brunig-Stearns.
Good evening. Tonight it is my very great pleasure to introduce Dr. Marion Nestle. I first met Dr. Nestle when I entered the PhD program in nutrition at New York University. She had been recruited to their nutrition department to serve as chair and had just completed her years of service as Senior Nutrition Policy Analyst to the Surgeon General of the United States. While she was with the Surgeon General, who at the time was Dr. C. Everett Koop, she was managing editor of the first ever Surgeon General's Report on Nutrition and Health, which was published in 1988. This was the first time a Surgeon General had ever directed major initiatives around nutrition. During her years in Washington, she developed a network of policy analysts and gained expert knowledge on how food and nutrition policy comes about in the United States. This eventually led to the publication of her book, Food Politics. For me, it was an eye-opening read. Prior to reading it, I was woefully underinformed about the influence of various corporate and political sectors on the nutrition messages that get distributed to Americans in the name of public health. Dr. Nestle has been blogging on her website, foodpolitics.com, since 2007. I try to check in with it at least weekly, and if she ever retires from writing it, I will have a much more difficult time staying informed about food and nutrition policy issues. She has kept her fingers on the pulse of food and nutrition policy and shares her reasoning for the view she takes on these issues. She has done this at considerable risk. If you read her books or her blog, you will see that big food corporations threaten to sue her regularly. One incident that I found amusing or ridiculous was when the Sugar Association threatened to sue her for calling high fructose corn syrup a sugar. For those of us in nutrition, high fructose corn syrup meets every definition of a sugar. In 2010, the Falk College collaborated with the CNY Masters in Public Health program to bring Dr. Nestle to Syracuse. We had a question and answer session for a standing room only group of SU nutrition and other students in the afternoon. I cannot remember the triggering question, but someone asked something that led Dr. Nestle to say, "Larger portions have more calories." I could not stifle a laugh. To those of us in nutrition, that is a no-brainer. And she turned to me and said, "You laugh." But she made the point that there are many people who don't get that. Fast forward to this past spring, I was on the NYU campus visiting a former professor and ran into Dr. Nestle near the elevator on my way out. I knew that her newest book, Why Calories Count, was scheduled for release, and I asked her about it. She invited me to her office and gave me a copy of the book, which was co-authored by Dr. Marion Nestle. This fall, as we worked with the Vice Chancellor's staff to plan her visit today, a group of nutrition students formed a book club to read this book in preparation for her visit, and they met with her this afternoon in a small group session to ask questions about the book and her other work. Over the years, Dr. Nestle has made many public appearances for various groups, spreading the message about the pressing issues around food and nutrition that must be addressed for a healthy and productive America and the world. Not too long ago, she shared a podium with Prince Charles, who you may not know owns an organic farm in the UK. Today we welcome Dr. Nestle again. Food and nutrition policy issues affect all of us on some level. At Syracuse University, we have excellent academic programs in both public policy and food and nutrition. In the United States, we have a food system that is directly tied to public health and healthcare expenditures, but that does not always serve to make the public healthier. All of us eat, and there is growing awareness about the source of our food, where and how it is produced, its safety, and the societal and health implications of those practices. We in attendance tonight are fortunate that our university has the resources to bring to campus such a well-known and engaging speaker, arguably the top national expert on food and nutrition policy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Marion Nestle.
Thank you, Kay, for that wonderful and extremely embarrassing introduction. And thank you all for coming. It's really exciting to be here. Let me see if I can do this so I can get at it. Can we get the lights down on the slides? I think that would help. Otherwise, I don't think you're going to be able to see them otherwise. What I'm going to do tonight is to talk about the kinds of work that I do in food policy and try to explain a little bit about why I think about these kinds of issues in the way I do. Let me start by saying that we've just had a big trauma in New York City, and this was how I learned who had won the presidential election, because my apartment did not have internet service or telephone service on election night. When the Empire State Building turned blue at 11:30, I knew who had won. This has big implications for food politics, as I will explain. I approach these kinds of issues from the point of view of food systems. And what I mean by food system is the entire food production and consumption system, from agriculture to food, from nutrition to public health, which is why my department and the department here at Syracuse are joining agriculture to nutrition and public health. And this is a new way of thinking about food. When I first started out in nutrition, it never occurred to me that agriculture had anything to do with the way people eat. And now I think you can't understand anything about food in America or anywhere else in the world without understanding how the agricultural system works. And I'll try to give some evidence for that. I like to think about this in the way that Michael Pollan did in his letter to the farmer-in-chief shortly before President Obama was first elected in 2008. And Pollan recommended re-solarization of the American farm system. I love his words. Meaning doing something about energy policy. He thought that the farm system ought to be re-regionalized, focusing on local and regional food production systems because that would be much healthier for people and the planet, a rebuilding of America's food culture so that people would appreciate fresh food and natural food and not food that wasn't so processed and industrialized, and turning the Farm Bill into a bill that really focused on food. And I was inspired by that to teach a course on the Farm Bill at New York University last year. And on my first class day, I asked the class what they thought an ideal farm policy ought to look like. And they came up with this list, which I think describes the ideal and what many of us are working for. An ideal farm policy ought to provide enough food so that everybody has enough to eat, and that the people who are working as farmers and as people in food processing plants also have enough to live on and eat. It needs to promote a local, regional, and sustainable food system, promote fruits and vegetables so people would be healthier, and do some good things for food trade and aid, and at the same time, protecting natural resources, promoting animal welfare, and preventing climate change, pollution, and unnecessary waste. This is a huge order for any piece of legislation, let alone a piece of legislation that comes out of a deeply divided Congress. We don't have an ideal farm policy. What we do have is a farm policy that supports, to the tunes of billions of dollars a year, corn, wheat, and soybeans, and virtually nothing for fruits and vegetables. And this, of course, makes no sense whatsoever, because federal nutrition policy advises making half the plate fruits and vegetables. So we have a big dichotomy between agricultural policy and public health policy, and the goal of any kind of agriculture, food, and public health system should bring the two together so that agricultural policy supports public health policy. And the best place to see the effects of the disconnect between agriculture and public health policy is in rising rates of obesity in the United States. I have an arrow pointing to 1980 because I want you to pay attention to 1980. That's when everything changed. Starting in 1980, rates of obesity started to grow. Rates of obesity started to rise quite rapidly. Roughly a third of the population is considered to be obese and 2/3 considered to be overweight. And if we want to do something about that, I think doing something about it is very simple on a personal level. If you're worried about your weight, you need to eat less, you need to move more, eat more fruits and vegetables, don't eat too much junk food, enjoy what you're eating, and please don't eat my book. If it seems more complicated than that, it's surely because of the effect of this kind of advice on the food industry. The way I like to put it is eating less is really bad for business. And this was beautifully expressed by an executive of Coca-Cola a few years ago in an interview with Advertising Age, in which she talked about how obesity had become the Achilles heel of the food industry. It used to be something they didn't have to pay any attention to at all. And now it's something that they have to confront every single day of their working lives, and they don't like it very much. And I'll have more to say about that. So let's go back to the rise in rates of obesity starting in 1980 and ask, or in the early 1980s, and ask the obvious question: what was it that happened in the early 1980s that either made people less active, eating more or doing both. Let me deal with the less active part. First, I don't want to make too big a deal about this because I don't think the data are very good. But the data that are available tend to show very, very little change in reported physical activity from the early 1980s until the present. If you ask people about their activity levels, people report slightly more activity. If you ask people about inactivity, they report slightly less inactivity. I think the truth is someplace flat. It's very, very difficult to demonstrate, even with computers, that people are less active. Let's just leave it as a question and just say the data aren't very good. But there's no question at all that people are eating more now than they did in 1980. And there are two sources of data for that. The first is the number of calories in the food supply. In the early 1980s, there were about 3,200 calories available for every man, woman, and little tiny baby in the country. Now it's 3,900, an increase of 700 calories. Now that doesn't mean that people are eating 700 calories a day more on average, because these are food supply data, which means amount of food produced plus imports less exports. But there's another set, and probably a lot of that is wasted. But there's another source of data, and that is you ask people what they eat, and they lie. But what they tell you in the early 1980s was that they were consuming about 1,900 calories a day, and now it's 2,100, an increase of 200 calories a day. This is probably an underestimation. So the truth is someplace in between. And in fact, most of the studies that have looked at the number of calories that have to be increased in the diet per person in order to account for current levels of obesity is somewhere on the order of 350 or 400 more calories a day now than people were eating in 1980 on average. And that, of course, raises the question, why are people eating more now than they were in the early 1980s? And I think the answer to that question, perhaps unexpectedly, is deregulation. And there are three kinds of deregulation that occurred beginning in the early 1980s. The first was a change in agricultural policy, which instead of paying farmers not to grow food and to leave fields fallow, began to pay farmers to grow as much food as they possibly could. Farmers are very efficient. They grew as much food as they possibly could, and the result was mountains of corn in a sea of farm subsidies. That made the food industry very competitive, and it accounts for the rise in calories, increasing competition. This is a longer plot of calories in the food supply, roughly 3,200 for most of the 20th century, starting in 1980, where the arrow is a sharp increase. Largely as a result of a change in agricultural policy. And even if a lot of that is wasted, as the Department of Agriculture says it is, it's still a great surplus of food. That made the food industry very competitive. But on top of that, Wall Street policy changed in the early 1980s from a policy that valued blue chip stocks, those that gave long, slow returns on investment, and instead demanded higher immediate returns on investment. And all of this was attributed to a speech by Jack Welch, who was then head of General Electric, who said, we want higher returns on investment, and we want them right now. What that did was change the way that Wall Street evaluated corporations. Instead of valuing long, slow returns, they began to value immediate returns and to require companies and corporations to increase their profits every 90 days. That's been difficult for all corporations, and we see the results of that on Wall Street now. But for food corporations, it was especially difficult because they were already trying to sell food in an environment in which there were nearly twice as many calories available per day as the population needed. And now they not only had to make a profit, but they had to grow their profit. Then they were aided in this by the third kind of deregulation, which was deregulation of marketing to children. And that also occurred in about 1980 at the time when President Reagan came in with a deregulatory agenda. And the immediate result of that was that spending on children's advertising occurred very, very rapidly. That's marketing of all different products, not just food. But within the next few years, there was also deregulation of health claims on dietary packages, on food packages, deregulation of dietary supplements, and an enormous erosion of the funding of the Food and Drug Administration and its authority and an oversight over these kinds of issues. So the result of all of this was a change in society, which people didn't notice because they were living through it. And the most obvious way in which society changed was that because food was greatly available in surplus, prices were low, people could afford to eat out more, and did. And starting in 1980, there was an increase in the percentage of food dollars spent outside the home, much of that on fast food. Because food was cheap and subsidized and plentiful, fast food places could proliferate and sell food at very low cost and very high calories. Food outside the home has more calories than food produced inside the home. The most obvious place in which society changed was that portion sizes began to increase. And the blue bars at the bottom of this slide are the introduction of large-size portions into the food supply. They started in the early 1980s, and they went up in parallel with calories per capita per day and with rising rates of obesity. So those of you who are epidemiologists will see that this is correlation, it's not causation. But I think that large portion sizes have a great deal to do with the rise in obesity because, as Kay pointed out and quoted, larger portions have more calories. And that's shown by my former doctoral student, now Dr. Lisa Young, who studied the introduction, and those blue bars were her data. She studied the introduction of large-sized portions into the food supply, and here she is at a talk she was giving on showing what has happened to movie theater sodas. The white cup on the left is a standard Department of Agriculture serving for a soft drink. It holds 8 ounces, and if it doesn't have too much ice in it, it's about 100 calories. The other cups were bought at our local movie theater near NYU, and the double gulp holds 64 ounces and 800 calories. And the research shows that that big cup is not passed down the aisle in the pew here and shared among everyone sitting next to you. It's consumed by one person. Larger portions have more calories. And the reason that everybody laughs when I say that is because it's not, in fact, I mean, it's sort of obvious, but it's really not. And that's shown by the work of Dr. Brian Wansink, who's a professor at Cornell and who's kind of a character, as you can tell from this photograph. And this is a summary of his famous Super Bowl experiment, in which he invited his own students, trained, who should have known better, to come to his house and watch the Super Bowl. And he put half of them in one room with 2-quart bowls of popcorn or snacks, and the other half in another room with 4-quart bowls of snacks. And at the end of the Super Bowl, he just counted up how much they had eaten. And the students who had been given the 4-quart bowls ate almost twice as many calories as those that had been given the 2-quart bowls. And when he asked them, how many calories do you think you consumed? The ones with the larger bowls they underestimated the number of calories they were eating by a much larger fraction than the ones who had given smaller portions. So large portion sizes alone distort the way people think about these kinds of things. These were his own students. They had been trained to know that large portions have more calories and induce people to eat more calories. Another way of encouraging food consumption is to make food available everywhere. And these are 3 pictures of places taken in New York City. Duane Reade is a drugstore that there's one on practically every block in New York City. It's now looks like a supermarket. Bed and bath shops now have food everywhere. And my favorite is Staples, which now has a section on office snacks. If food is available, people will buy it. And if they buy it, they will eat it. And the next one is low prices. If you go to McDonald's with about $5, you can buy 5 hamburgers or 1 salad. What's wrong with that picture? Isn't that bizarre? I think it's bizarre, but it has to do with agricultural policy that makes the price of some foods cheaper than other kinds of foods. Most of the subsidized foods are things that go for feed for animals, and so it keeps the cost of meat lower than it would be otherwise. And if poor people complain that the price of fruits and vegetables is too high, it's because the price of fruits and vegetables is too high. And here's a graph from the Commerce Department showing the change in indexed price of various foods from 1980 to, this one goes to 2009. But the index price of fresh fruits and vegetables went up by 40% in that period of time, whereas the index price of beer, butter, and sodas went down by 15 to 30%. So again, this is agricultural policy and national policy expressed in ways that deeply affect public health. And the result of all of this is a food environment in which the government and food companies inadvertently, certainly not deliberately, food companies didn't sit around saying, how can we make people fat? They sat around conference tables saying, how are we going to sell our products in a food environment that is this competitive? And the result of that was a food environment that encourages people to eat more, as more often and in more places and more times of day and in greater quantities than they need or want. And these are the kinds of things that a lawyer in San Francisco named Michelle Simon talks about in a book that she wrote called Appetite for Profit, how the food industry undermines our health and what to do about it. And in the early part of her book, she actually makes you very sympathetic to the plight of food companies which are just simply trying to make a living because they're under pressure from advocates who want them to change their ways and not market to children and advertise inappropriately. They're under pressure from regulators who are just dying to regulate them. They're under pressure from lawyers who really want to sue them every chance they get. And mostly they're under pressure from Wall Street, which simply wants them to make money every 90 days and grow the amount that they're making. And food companies, shocked by all of this, started out first by doing nothing and saying, obesity has nothing to do with us. Then they went through all the stages of death and denial, and then finally they began to change their products, particularly with health claims, and fighting back. And fighting back involved lobbying, it involved attacking critics, always blaming inactivity for the problem and blaming personal choice. If you were only personally responsible, we wouldn't be having this problem. So let me say just a few things about that. First of all, if food companies want to sell products, the way they have to do it is through advertising. That's the first line of approach. And it's very difficult to get precise figures about how much is spent on food marketing, but Advertising Age once a year publishes some data on this, and if you take food, beverage, and alcohol companies all together, they spend about $16 billion on advertising and marketing that goes through advertising agencies, so it's countable. This is countable advertising. They spend a lot more than that in ways that don't go through advertising. And it's difficult to get figures on specific products, but Advertising Age lists a few of them, and it's kind of amazing to think that Tostitos has a $35 million annual budget, or Pop-Tarts $51 million, or Coca-Cola $267 million just on those individual products and just in the United States. No public health agency or advocacy group or anything else can possibly compete with that kind of money. They also use health claims in ways that sell products. We're a very health conscious country. You might not realize that from looking at our health statistics, but people really care about their health. And so food companies like to advertise the health benefits of their products, and they do so in sort of interesting ways, and researchers have said that almost any health claim on a food product, whether it's organic or low fat or no trans fat or having a lot of vitamin D or immunity, makes people think that these products don't have as many calories as they do. So there's a sort of a health aura that comes about there. And so people think that organic junk foods or organic candy has fewer calories in it than candy that isn't organic. It's a terrific sales method, and for people who are in a hurry and just grabbing something, you see these health messages and you think, aha, a health food. So these were the kinds of things that made a colleague in Boston and I write an article for the Journal of the American Medical Association in which we asked the question, a rhetorical question really, can the food industry play a constructive role in the obesity epidemic? And we were dubious about whether something like that is possible, because the goals of industry are to make money. That's their job. And the goals of public health are to try to keep people healthy. And these are not necessarily congruent goals, and I'll give you some examples of that. So as the most obvious example, let me say something about Michelle Obama's fascinating, interesting, and I think highly laudable campaign to try to solve the problem of childhood obesity in the United States within a generation. She didn't think it was going to happen quickly, but she thought within a generation it might be possible if we made policy changes. And the White House appointed a task force on childhood obesity that came out with a report in May 2010 that set out the agenda for Mrs. Obama's Let's Move campaign. And her Let's Move campaign focused on school food, and I thought that was a really good decision. Schools are a great place to make changes, and important changes in society, and children are the future, and I thought it was a really good idea. And among the recommendations that the task force made were to have dietary principles that would govern the food that was sold in schools or served in schools, that there would be standards for the kind of meals that were served, and there would be nutrition standards for the kinds of meals that were served, and that overall the food in schools and elsewhere should encourage healthy eating, or the policy should encourage healthy eating and discourage unhealthy eating. So here's the first of them. The first piece that came out of Let's Move campaign, which was the Choose My Plate icon, which came attached to consumer messages that I thought were really pretty terrific. The first one was, enjoy your food. What a concept. I don't ever remember seeing a government agency come out with enjoy your food, amazing. But eat less. Avoid oversized portions. Very, very good advice. Make half your plate fruit and vegetables, fine, but what about agricultural policy? And then I like the last one, to drink water instead of sugary drinks. Okay, so these principles are now supposed to govern what goes on in schools. Now, Mrs. Obama wasn't the first person to try to do something about school food. Actually, the government agencies were trying to do something about it before the Obamas were elected. And the Institute of Medicine, which is the think tank in Washington, came out in 2007 with a report on nutrition standards for foods in schools, and that was followed up 2 years later by a report on how to do school meals, building blocks for healthy children. And these reports laid out the principles of what was going to happen in school meals. And these reports were reinforced and adopted, the recommendations were adopted into the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act of 2010, which was obviously passed in 2010, which authorized the Department of Agriculture to implement the Institute of Medicine's rules in schools. And the Department of Agriculture did that. It took those recommendations and came out with a notice in January 2012 of what the standards in schools were going to be. And those standards, among a lot of other things, included two that turned out to be exceptionally controversial. One was to limit starchy vegetables to 2 servings a week, not eliminate them, but eliminate them. Starchy vegetable means French fries. You have to translate that. And then another was that it would remove an exemption for tomato paste and require tomato paste to be present in at least a half cup serving in order to be counted as a vegetable, because the rules have certain numbers of servings of vegetables. So the food companies didn't like that. And didn't like the recommendations at all, because they would restrict the products that could be sold in schools, and they spent a reported $5.6 million to lobby against the rules. And when that didn't work, they went to Congress and complained to Congress, and Congress inserted a couple of amendments into an agricultural spending bill that knocked out the restriction on the number of times that potatoes could be served in school during the week, and then said that they wouldn't allow the Department of Agriculture to use any of its money to require any particular volume of tomato paste. And that, of course, turned pizza into a vegetable. And so this, as you can see here, so I was kind of stunned by this. Doesn't Congress have anything better to do than to override tiny little rules that the Department of Agriculture has spent years working out? Apparently, it doesn't have anything any better to do. Now, we're not done with school meals yet, because the standards have gone into effect this fall, and they elicited in some communities a great deal of protest from students. I don't know how many of you have seen this YouTube video of high school students fainting of hunger because they only get to have 850 calories for lunch. I don't know, I think 850 calories should be enough to get any high school student through a couple of hours of school. But that's not really what these protests are about. 2 Republican congressmen introduced an act, the No Hungry Kids Act, so moved by the plight of these starving students that they introduced this act. But if you go on the website and look at what this act really was about, it's about criticisms of President Obama's nanny state. The new regulations are a one-size-fits-all encroachment of our liberties. Pretty strong words. So the school meal standards got caught up in election year politics. An advocacy group in Washington, D.C., Center for Science in the Public Interest, is trying to fight back on this, and this is one of its advertising pieces in which it points out the several meals in the 850-calorie ballpark, and they point out that if these were what the meals looked like, the Congress wouldn't be dealing with it. It's because these lunches are going to have more fruits, vegetables, and whole grain, fat-free and low-fat milk, and less salt, that this has become mired in election year politics. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with this. My guess is the kids will get used to eating more interesting vegetables. In all of these discussions, soft drinks come up frequently in discussion because soft drinks are an obvious target for intervention if you're worried about obesity. They have sugars, water, and nothing else. They're liquid candy. They are heavily advertised to young people, very, very heavily advertised, and they're very heavily advertised in minority and low-income communities. So there's a lot of concern about sodas these days. And that brings me to my mayor, Michael Bloomberg, who on May 30th announced that he planned to ban soda sizes larger than 16 ounces in whatever city institutions he had jurisdiction over. He doesn't have jurisdiction over all of them, but there are quite a lot. And the idea here was to make a smaller portion size the default. People tend to eat the default. They eat what's in front of them. If the default is smaller, people will eat smaller portions. If the default is larger, people will eat whatever's in it. And the 16, I don't know why he picked the 16-ounce size. It's roughly 10% of average calorie intake. It's about 200 calories for some sodas. It contains about 50 grams of sugars of one kind or another, and it's kind of at the upper limit of what most public health recommendations are for limitations on sugar. What's interesting about it is the 16-ounce soda used to be the big one. In the 1950s, it was introduced as a big 16-ounce size, serving 3. Try to think about that. Things have changed. So the first thing that happened was the soda industry fought back with big full-page ads in the New York Times. No, soda and sugar-sweetened beverages are not driving obesity. Everybody has the facts all wrong. Mayor Bloomberg and his health department have the facts all wrong. So the first thing they did was to attack the science. The second thing they did was to attack the critic. And this is Mayor Bloomberg posing as the nanny. Bloomberg has a great sense of humor. I don't know him personally, but I thought this piece was kind of amazing. So at a press conference, he was asked what he thought about this ad, and he said, "Oh no, I would never wear a dress like that. It's so unflattering." Well, then the industry really went to town. And they did this fantastic, massive advertising campaign in New York City that involved social media, radio and television ads, videos in movie theaters, airplanes, T-shirts, and they paid a very, very large number of young people $30 an hour to go around and collect signatures on a petition to end the soda cap, causing some people to say that this was the best employment act that anybody had ever done. I mean, $30 an hour is not bad. I live in Manhattan, and I was kind of amazed to get this mailing to me or the current resident. It wasn't exactly a personal mailing. I'm a proud New Yorker. I can make my own beverage choices. I want to take a stand to protect my freedom of choice. I cannot imagine how much all of this cost. The mayor passed it anyway, but this was actually one of my favorite pieces that came out. It was an op-ed piece in the New York Times from the head of Honest Tea, the CEO of Honest Tea, who argued in this op-ed that independent small companies like his would be very, very hurt by the soda cap, and it would really impair their ability to make a living. And his op-ed piece didn't mention that his company is owned by Coca-Cola. Dishonest tea. And then when all of that failed because the health board passed the soda cap, and that was no surprise to anybody because Bloomberg appoints all the members of the health board. When all that fails, the soda industry has sued and taken the city to court to limit the sales on the basis of the First Amendment, which gives them the right to do anything they want, I guess. So that's where we are now. It's in litigation, but most people who are looking at this don't think that the litigation is going to get very far. So this brings me to the whole question of soda taxes, which are kind of a big issue these days. Today, or a couple of days ago, Denmark announced that its fat tax, its tax on butter and other sources of fat, that it instituted a year ago, has proven so unpopular with the food industry, and that they're willing, the food industry is just so angry and upset about it that even though it is in fact bringing in the kind of money that Denmark hoped it would, they're giving it up. I didn't think that fat was a very good thing to tax. It's too hard to tax products that contain fat. It's much, much easier to think about a single product like sodas. And by this time, there's a fair amount of research that indicates the public health and economic benefits of taxing sugar-sweetened beverages. And there are a number of places that are trying that. Soda companies are extremely worried about soda taxes, and they're worried about soda taxes to a very, very, very large amount of money. Before the subject of soda taxes came up, Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, and the American Beverage Association spent about $1 million a year each on lobbying around issues related to soda. In 2009, when the issue of soda taxes came up, they spent a total of $38 million on fighting soda taxes and won every battle they were in. So here's one of the battles that they have won more recently. Richmond, California, which is a small town on the East Bay across from San Francisco. A member of the city council, shown here, concerned about high rates of obesity and soda consumption in Richmond, got a soda tax initiative on the ballot. And Richmond's an interesting place. It's a very poor community. The average income is $23,000 a year. It's got at least an 11% unemployment rate. It's 80% Black and Hispanic. It has very, very high soda consumption and very high rates of obesity. And so this was partly this was a place where this might do some good. The soda companies and the soda industry, through a supposedly grassroots coalition paid for by the American Beverage Association, put $2.2 million into defeating the Richmond soda tax, whereas the soda tax people only had about $25,000. The ratio was 87-1, so it's no surprise that it was defeated. It was defeated by a very wide margin. 67% of the voters voted against it, largely because the advertising campaign against it focused on how regressive the tax was, and that how it was going to harm low-income residents of the city, who are, of course, the ones who are most affected by obesity. And most analysts thought that the pro-tax forces needed to do much better community work around this issue. But there's a reason why soda companies are so concerned about taxes and other anti-soda initiatives, or initiatives that are perceived as anti-soda, and that has to do with buying patterns. Between 2002 and 2007, sales of sodas in the United States, sugar-sweetened beverages, were flat or declining, but they were increasing everywhere else in the world, in every other region. And that you can see by the way in which these companies are trying to keep their growth targets up. If your sales in the United States are flat, what do? You go overseas. So and every major food company has done this. So PepsiCo's profits in 2010 almost doubled on overseas beverages. PepsiCo has just united with Suntory to get into the Vietnam beverage market. Coca-Cola is going into India, which is responsible for 20% of its, where the 20% increase in profits. India has 1.2 billion people, and they're not drinking nearly enough Coke. McDonald's is doing the same thing. India, China, these are big emerging economies with billions of people, and this is just seen as an enormous market. And Kentucky Fried Chicken is going into Africa and Myanmar. These are just from a couple of weeks ago. Rates of obesity in all of these countries are also rising very rapidly, and this is probably not a coincidence. Now, I would be very depressed about this if I didn't think that a food revolution was very much in season, but I think it is. And I'm often asked, how do you stay optimistic in the light of all of the things you've been talking about? And I just think there's enormous cause for optimism. The number of people who are here tonight is part of that. Thank you very much. I think we're in the middle of a movement around food that's not like typical social movements like the civil rights movement or the environmental movement or the women's movement. It's much more fragmented than that, with many different goals. There's the organic revolution and the animal welfare revolution, the slow food revolution, the locavore movement, and the edible movement. But all of these groups that are working on these kinds of issues have in mind a better food system, better for the planet, and certainly better for the health of people who are living in it. And I think that you can count. There are quantitative ways in which to measure the strength of this movement. It's not enormous, but it is growing and growing very significantly. And one way is to count the number of farmers markets throughout the country. In 1994, there were 1,700. Now there's 7,100 and rising. Every community wants its farmers market. You've got a very nice one here, and maybe more. The organic food sales, despite all the controversy about organics, they continue. The sales of organics continue to rise and have risen consistently since the early 2000s when the organic standards went into effect. All the numbers are going up. The number of movies about food issues, I see that you're having some kind of movie series here, and some of these are showing. There are lots and lots and lots. I get sent probably once a week. I get sent a movie. I'm even in a couple of these. It's kind of fun. But these are very good, and they have a very big impact on the people who watch them. And then there's the local food movement, and I just went online to see what was going on in Syracuse, and these were just the things that kind of picked up. But every local community has an enormous number of things that are going on in which there are people who are working in many, many different ways to make the food system better for agriculture, better for people, and better for the planet. And you can hardly keep up with them. There are so many. I asked a student at NYU if she could just, make me a list of all of the food, the pieces, the organizations working on food issues in the country, and she quickly gave up. She said it was just hopeless. There were so many. So even at universities, which are often the last institutions to make change, there are programs in food studies and academic journals of food studies coming out everywhere. We started our program at NYU in 1996, and Syracuse is in the middle of developing one right now. You've got faculty, you've got courses, you've got students, and it's coming along really well, and it's very, very exciting to watch all of the places in the country that are developing programs around food. So all of this coming together makes me think that there's plenty that you can do as individuals, and there's plenty that we as a society can do. As individuals, you can take personal responsibility by voting with your fork every time you make a food choice. You can elect to choose food, not food products. You can choose smaller portions. You can buy local, regional, and sustainable. You can grow your own food. Cook at home, teach kids to cook. teach kids to grow food, teach kids where food comes from. These will make enormous changes in your life, their lives, and you'll be giving them skills that they can use forever. But at the same time, I think we have to vote with our votes and get political and take a social responsibility for creating a food system that is just healthier and that links agriculture to public health in a much stronger way than has ever been possible before. And so these are my lists of activities and things that people can get involved in, ranging from farmers markets to farm supports, and in public health from schools to Wall Street. So any place in the spectrum where you'd like to get involved, there's a place for you. And if you're feeling really radical, you can occupy the food system, as some of our students did. And by that, it means trying to take action and take political action to make the food system better for everybody, rich and poor alike. So we have 4 more years. Join the food movement, and these are the kinds of things I talk in my book, talk about in my book, Why Calories Count, and I thank you very, very much for the privilege of speaking to you tonight. Yeah. What happens now? Do I answer questions? What do I do now? I stand here and answer questions.
Raise your hand if you want to ask a question.
Ah, there's a microphone there, and is there another microphone? Yeah, okay.
Your thoughts on the defeated GMO proposition in California?
$46 million worth of anti-GMO contributions. That did it. I was for it. I'm for GMO labeling. I think it's a really good idea. I've been for it since I was on the FDA Food Advisory Committee in the early 1990s. We warned the FDA and we warned the biotechnology industry that if they didn't label their products, nobody would ever trust them, and that was a big issue in consumer attitudes about food. They didn't listen. What can I say? So they're in for it now, and the Proposition 37 initiative in California, which failed by a smaller margin than, well, it's either big or small depending on whether you're an optimist or a pessimist. But the food industry put $46 million into fighting that. And so what that has made, what that has done to the Just Label It activists is to say, ooh, let's start these in lots of other places. Let's turn GMO labeling into whack-a-mole. If they defeat it in one place, it'll pop up in lots of others, and it's going to cost the industry a lot of money, and maybe eventually they'll get the idea that labeling will not bring the world to an end. I don't think, I've got a candy bar from Great Britain that says may be made with genetically modified corn, soy, or sugar. Labeling's no big deal. And I think they should be labeled. But I thought money buys politics, and that was a really great example.
I wondered if you had an opinion about the work of Gary Taubes. He has a different analysis about why we get fat.
Oh, Gary Taubes and I agree on probably 98% of this, and Gary Taubes believes that everything is due to sugar. That's an exaggeration, but I'm greatly in favor of reducing sugar consumption, and that's the bottom line. And the rest of it is arcane scientific disputes. But the bottom line, I think we're in complete agreement. People would be a lot healthier if they ate less sugar, particularly from soft drinks.
Hi, right here. Thanks so much for your talk. It's incredibly interesting and very important topic. I was wondering if you could speak about the French paradox at all. I noticed you discussed fat-free and skim milk in lunches, but I wonder, does it lead to more satisfaction and more enjoyment of food to have small portions that are
they didn't ask me about the standards either. I probably wouldn't have bothered with some of that. The reason for skim milk is that whole milk is a major source of saturated fat in the diets of children on average. And so I think that was the rationale for doing that. The French paradox is that the French don't have as high rates of obesity, but they eat much richer food than we do. They don't eat as much sugar. They don't snack as much. And the portions are smaller. So it's still about calories, but it's done in a very different way. And there are a number of books now by Americans who raised children in France and then brought them back to America or moved them back and forth. And they're just fascinating to read because the French school lunch system is so different than ours. For one thing, all the kids eat lunch. Everybody does. And it's across the board. It's assumed that all kids will eat lunch. The teachers eat with them. They have a reasonable amount of time in which to eat their meal. It's expected that they will sit at the table. The table will be set. They will be polite at the table. They will pass food around. I mean, things that are unheard of in American schools. So it's a completely different culture. And in particular, one of the books, the one by Karen Le Billion, Karen Le Billion, it's spelled. I mean, her book is just marvelous. She brought these American kids to France, picky eaters. And by the time the year was over, her picky eaters were eating everything. And came back to the United States and were appalled by the kind of food that they got in school. So this is a whole cultural thing. But they're not eating as many calories. So.
Thank you, very informative. I run a community center, and this September we switched to healthy snacks for our children. We begin at 6 weeks and go up through our senior citizens, and we also serve an after-school program. For 172 children in early childhood, we are running $1,000 more per month for 2 snacks a day. For our school-age children, we have about 115 children in after-school, 1 snack when they come into us. We are running about $300 to $400 per month. Mm-hmm. So here we are offering a salad bar to children, all healthy snacks, and we need a little bit more subsidy. Mm-hmm. And they need to get that information out to places such as mine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's policy, right? I mean, that's policy. If we had political will in this country that feeding children was something that was important, that made a difference, and that was something that the country was going to invest in, we have enough money in this country to do that. You know, this is a question of political priorities, and that's why political activity around these kinds of issues is so important. I mean, is what you're doing sustainable? It may not be at that rate, and then you've got to figure out some way to do it if you care deeply about it. I've been in public schools where they have transformed their lunch program, and it requires an enormous commitment among the adults to decide that this is something that is so important to do that they're going to make the kinds of sacrifices and spend the extra time and develop relationship with suppliers and so forth to do it. But when I see the videos of kids who are complaining that 850 calories isn't enough for lunch, I want to know where the adults are in that situation, because school food is extremely person dependent, at least in my experience from what I've seen. You go into a school and I can tell in an instant by talking to the school food service director and watching what's going on, whether the kids are going to be eating the food or not. I mean, there are 2 issues. One is that the food has to be good, and the other is the kids have to eat it. And it turns out those are 2 different sets of skills, not necessarily always in the same person. But there are schools in which these things are happening. They really are, and they're joyous to see. You know, they bring tears to your eyes. So I don't know, courage. I don't know, do a fundraiser for her. Or complain to your Congress, your congressional representatives, which might be a better way to do it.
Hi, you mentioned that limiting starchy foods has been helpful in promoting healthier lifestyles in certain school districts. So here in Syracuse, in our dining halls, we have an idea floating around called Meatless Mondays.
Ah, yes.
And I was wondering, do you agree that deciding on not to eat Mondays does not necessarily promote a healthier lifestyle?
There was a negative in that I didn't quite get. Could you rephrase it?
Like, do you agree that just because you don't eat meat, it doesn't mean that you're actually being healthier?
Oh, it depends on what else you eat, obviously. Obviously. But, Los Angeles has just passed Meatless Monday for its schools. I'm not sure about that. I just saw something about it, but I haven't read the whole thing. Meatless Monday is an idea that came out of the Center for Livable Future at Johns Hopkins as a way to encourage people to eat more vegetables, which are healthy, and to reduce the amount of meat that they're eating. High meat consumption is not associated with health to the same extent, but obviously it depends on everything else making one change is only one change in a diet that's 7 days. So for some people it might make a difference, and for others it might not. Depends on what else they eat.
I was just, sorry, over here.
I'm lost. I can't. Oh, there you are.
I was just wondering what your thoughts are on the soy controversy, fermented versus non-fermented, and like the estrogen type compounds.
Yeah, I have 2 books on my shelf in my office. The title of one of them is Soy is Panacea, and the other is Soy is Poison. Obviously, those aren't the titles, but that's what the books are about. One of the books is about how soy is going to solve all of your nutritional problems in one fell swoop. And the other one is don't touch it because it's poison. And when I see those kinds of things about a food, I think, okay, let's take the average. And the average is right smack down the middle. It's just a food. Don't eat too much of it. It's fine. If you like it, eat it. If you don't like it, it's not an essential nutrient. It's probably not a panacea, and it's probably not a poison. Though. So I'm a soy agnostic. No. Sorry. Oh, you asked 2 things. What would I like to see and what's possible? Those are not the same. I don't know what will happen. We have a very divided Congress. That hasn't changed in this election. We have a slim Democratic majority in the Senate and a Republican majority in the House. That does not bode for easy federal relations. The current status of the Farm Bill is if they don't get something passed within the next few weeks, it reverts to 1949. I have to confess I've never read the 1949 bill. I never saw any reason to until now. But it's probably worth a look. And anybody who has read it, and certainly the dairy farmers, are hysterical. The Northeast dairy farmers are beyond hysterical about the possibility that the 1949 bill might come in because it doesn't do anything for dairy farmers. So whether the government can get its act together to pass a bill is questionable, and what bill they will pass is an open question because the House didn't pass. They haven't reconciled what the Senate and House are doing. And none of those are particularly friendly to fruit and vegetable producers. There's little token amounts of money in there for fruit and vegetable producers. But the big thing that's holding up the Farm Bill is the food stamp program, because 80% of the funding in the Farm Bill is food stamps. Now might ask, what are food stamps doing in the Farm Bill? They're in there for politics, because separated, Most analysts that I've read think that we wouldn't have farm supports, and who knows what would happen to food assistance programs, but linking them together forced both of them to be passed. Whether that will change with all of the pressure to try to reduce SNAP benefits, is, I don't know the answer to it. The Department of, this is an interesting political twist. The Department of Agriculture usually releases statistics on the number of SNAP recipients on the first of the month. This year, they didn't do that. And they didn't do that because of the election on the 6th. They didn't want the announcement that another 1 million people had joined SNAP rolls and that it had just reached the highest level in history, something like $75 billion or something like that. They didn't want that to be an issue in the election. Whether that would have helped or hurt one candidate or another, I don't know. But it's a mess. Now, as to what I would like what I showed in the early slide. Let's have a farm policy that makes it possible to have sustainable agriculture and people paid and everybody eating healthfully. Wouldn't that be nice? And no climate change. Agriculture is responsible for as much greenhouse gas as transportation, industrial agriculture. No.
Over here, Marion.
Hi there. I wanted to ask, it's loud. I wanted to ask if you thought that the types of meat in America contributed to obesity rates rising in the steroid usage and such compared to other nations.
I don't know. I don't think the evidence is there. The evidence on obesity is about calories. So you have to ask where the calories come from. And people are eating more of everything across the board, but particularly carbohydrates of one kind or another. So there's been an increase in sugary drinks is one of the things that just leaps out of it. An increase in salad oils relative to animal fat. The meat industry argues that meat consumption is going down. They're not selling as much as they used to. The average meat intake for the population is only a couple of ounces a day, but lots of people don't eat meat, so that means it's hard to know what the distribution is in large meat eaters, but I don't think the evidence on how meat is raised is very compelling. It may be part of it, but I don't think we know.
Okay, thank you.
I work at the Dome, and I noticed that a lot of people buy Diet Pepsi instead of Pepsi. Do you think that's a positive or a negative?
I don't like artificial sweeteners. They violate my rule in what to eat of never eat anything artificial. So they're kind of off my radar. I don't like the way they taste. What they do in the body is, I don't know. The FDA says they're safe at current levels of intake. Okay. What is very clear is that there is no correlational relationship between consumption of diet drinks and loss and lower body weight. In fact, if you were going to do an epidemiological plot of the increase in use of artificial sweeteners, it would go up exactly in parallel with obesity. A perfect example of why correlation is not the same as causation. Nobody thinks that artificial sweeteners cause obesity, but there's certainly no evidence that they help people stay thinner, even though a lot of people drink them.
Hi, good evening. Back over here.
Thank you.
I'm working with a group in the Mohawk Valley, a little east of here, and we're about to launch and formalize a food policy council.
Oh, good.
So coming back to food policy, what do you think about food policy councils and the fact they're growing and doubling, and do you feel that's a good venue or a good way to get to the heart of some of these?
I think it's terrific because they're local And to the extent that the Food Policy Council is tuned in to the interests and needs of the community, they can really do a lot. Some food policy councils are really useful in writing reports and pushing the agenda and getting the city council and people who can make legislative changes make changes. Others are, sit around and talk. So it just depends. But one thing that a food policy council can do that's really useful is to try to get from the community what the goals are and what kinds of things the community wants to work on. If a community doesn't have a farmer's market, get a farmer's market. If they want to teach kids how to cook, figure out how to teach kids how to cook. I mean, these are doable things on a local level that are small enough to be actually doable and can have a very big effect on the way people eat and think about food. So have fun with it. It's a great opportunity.
This will be the last question.
I have a question sort of on the production policy side of things. So I work as a farmer in the area, and we would like to be growing food that's accessible to all populations, but realistically in this new sort of farm movement, smaller farms, more livestock, vegetable, grain integrated, other things like that, where you have more labor and less mechanization, et cetera, it requires a higher price point for food for us to make enough money, but then that means that our food is sort of out of reach for a lot of populations. Do you have any suggestions for A, how farmers like myself could make more money but also make our food more accessible to people? And B, are you aware of any ideas for how this food is being made more available to general population?
Yeah, I don't know anybody who's involved in the food movement who doesn't wake up in the middle of the night worrying about this. I mean, it's an obvious problem. And it has a lot to do with a federal policy that doesn't support local agriculture, small farmers. It supports big agriculture, doesn't support small agriculture, and leaves fruits and vegetables as specialty crops that really don't qualify for federal spending. So there's been a big push since the 2008 Farm Bill to try to change that in some ways. And there are a number of groups that are working on particularly working with food stamp recipients, SNAP recipients, to make their dollars go further at farmers markets. And there's a group called Wholesome Wave that's in the Northeast that is working in, I think they're in 500 farmers markets now, where they are setting up systems where people who don't have any money can have access to fresh fruits and vegetables. Obviously, that's a very small drop in a very big bucket. But I think this is a policy issue, and it means you're going to have to get involved in politics or get other people involved in politics to try to argue for making the price of fruits and vegetables affordable as a matter of national health policy. I mean, this is a question of public health. If the estimates are correct, and I can't argue that I don't know whether this estimate is correct, but the last economic estimate I saw of the cost of obesity to American taxpayers in healthcare, lost wages, lost productivity was $190 billion a year. That's a lot of money. And it seems to me that a very small investment in making fruits and vegetables available, teaching people how to cook them and how to use them, would save a lot of money in healthcare costs later on. At some point, the health policy people are going to get serious about this, as they have in places where there are nonprofit HMOs, like Kaiser Permanente in California, which has organic gardens on all of its hospital grounds now, because they're really committed to trying to prevent disease rather than having to spend a lot of money treating it. So I think it's going to happen. It doesn't help you right now deal with the question that you're dealing with. And I think we need to do it better. I don't have easy answers for that one, but I think it's really worth worrying about, and I'm very grateful that you raised the question. Thank you. I'm done? Let's go down.